So today I'm going to cover how town and parish councils might be involved in all aspects of the planning system. There's quite a lot of different things you can be involved in. First one is national planning. Now I'm speaking mainly about England. If there are questions about other countries in the UK, I can deal with them in a Q&A, but this is directed at an England audience for the time being. And in England, national policy is set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, or NPPF. It was created in 2012, although there had been many years of different national policy before. And it has been amended with increasing frequency. I think this partly reflects an increasing instability at national level in politics. So there was a major change in 2018. And a minor change is expected next month, covering housing and renewable energy. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of local councils being involved in shaping national policy. This year, we in the RTPI have been snowed under by government consultations about the planning system. And the problem is that if people and individual people and also groups such as local councils are not helping the government shape its own planning policy, by the time it gets to the other parts of the planning system I'll come on to, it's too late to make a difference. And whilst government policy does get tens of thousands of responses, some of these may be coming from a fairly limited number of groups. Maybe NGOs may encourage all their members to write in and make a response. So I'm not that convinced how representative responses to national policy is. And it's quite an obscure topic. It's quite hard for people on the street, on the village green to know about national policy consultations. You have to keep an eye out for them. And yet they can't, they totally set what happens in the country. They set greenbelt policy, they set flood policy, they set a current national policy which is very much slanted towards granting a lot of planning permissions for housing. That's a national ministerial choice. Ministers could choose other policies, we could have other ministers. So national policy is kind of where it's at. The next level down is the local plan, which will be prepared by a district council or a unitary council, depending on which part of the country you're in. Roughly half the country is now covered by unitary councils. That's gone up a lot recently with some major changes, such as North Yorkshire, which has gone unitary recently. And the local plan is something that the local planning authority is obliged to produce. They can be quite long. Part of my life is spent writing local plans, and I can tell you that they have got a lot longer since I stopped doing them. Well, it's nothing to do with me, but they seem to be much thicker than they were in the 80s when I did one. And the purpose of the local plans is two things. Firstly, to set out local policy. So when local planning authorities make planning decisions, people think, if you listen to the national press and some of the think tanks around, you'd think that councillors just make up decisions on planning applications sort of as they go along. But actually, legally, they must follow the local plan unless they can advance a legal reason why not to, which is called other material considerations, which you may have heard quoted at you. The second thing that a local plan does is site allocations. And these are to draw a red line around a piece of land within the district council area and to say this piece of land will be used for a particular use, or it could be for a mixed use. One of the ones that quite often affects people in rural England is that site allocations may be used to allocate greenfield farming land for housing purposes. And that is something that's very controversial. And the local plan is critical in doing that, because if a site allocation of a housing is made in a local plan, that's an almost overwhelming presumption in favour of planning permission on that site. And equally, if a site does not have an allocation for housing in the local plan and it's a greenfield site, it's an almost overwhelming presumption against development on that site. So there again, we've got national policy, which is where it's at for the general principles. Local plans are very much where it's at for the actual on-the-ground decision-making. Now, you'll appreciate that because local plans are so important, they also must go through a very careful legal process to be produced, which involves at least 2 phases of engagement with the public, including with town and parish councils. It involves the production of an evidence base, so that local council can't just say, oh, we feel like this should happen here. They must produce environmental data, social and economic data to back up their decisions. And then when the local plan has had its 2 stages of consultation, it gets sent to an organisation called the Planning Inspectorate, which you may also have heard of. And the plan is subject to an examination in public. This isn't an examination like GCSE. It's really a little bit more like a kind of court in which the inspector presides, and evidence is heard from people who support the plan, such as the council, people who may object to the plan, such as, for example, people who have land that is not the subject of a site allocation. And this examination takes place in a public place, so anyone can go and watch. Some people may be invited to give evidence at the examination. That depends on how you've been involved in the process up to that point. You can't just walk in and give evidence, but it may well be as a town or parish council that you are invited to give evidence, because you are very important to help the inspector come to his or her conclusion. The inspector will go away and mull over the evidence that he or she has received, and then roughly about 6 months later will produce a report. The report may, but not that often, give the council a green light to adopt the plan with no changes, or it may recommend that the plan is changed in some way, and there may have to be a further consultation in relation to the changes so that they're not unleashed on people without warning. And then the plan is adopted. The last and probably most familiar to you element of the planning system, as they've got national and local, is the planning application. Planning applications are needed for nearly any construction activity, and also for some changes of use, which people may not be aware of. So you may not build anything, but if you alter the use of a building from one use to another, that may require planning permission, although a little less these days than it used to. Planning applications must be determined by the planning committee in accordance with the plan. If they don't follow the plan, that could be the subject of a legal challenge to the decision. But sometimes plans are out of date. Often they are out of date, in which case this other material considerations things comes into play, where, for example, there may be new national policy which has overtaken the local plan, and the planning authority may very well need to take that into account in making a decision. So the local plan, if it's a bit old, like it's more than 5 years old, it may start becoming a bit less relevant in the decision making, and it may be overtaken by other priorities. Some planning applications are determined by planning officers, that's including some of my members working for councils, and those tend to be the smaller planning applications. The larger ones and the more controversial ones are always decided by councillors in planning committee. Now, people who made planning applications may not like the results they get from the planning authority. They may not like having a planning application refused. And in fact, you can then appeal back to the same planning inspectorate that I talked about in relation to local plans. You can appeal against a refusal of a planning permission. Actually, something like 5 to 6% of all planning applications are appealed against. And the planning inspectorate deals with something like 40,000 planning appeals a year, which is a phenomenal workload. Most appeals are processed by written representations. The more controversial and exciting planning appeals are dealt with by a thing called a planning inquiry, which is a bit like an examination in public. It's something where the inspector will hold a public meeting. That meeting may well go on for, in some cases, several weeks, and then the inspector will go away. The difference with a planning application is that the planning inspector has complete control. So the planning inspector will refuse or grant the appeal. There's no referring back to the local planning authority. Around 1/3 of appeals are successful. That's a figure that has remained almost unchanged my whole career. We're told that it makes no difference whether you proceed by public hearing or by written representations. And the thing it's particularly important for you to know is that you may not appeal against the grant of a planning permission. So the appeal process is reserved to applicants only. There are some countries which have what's called third-party right of appeal. I believe Ireland does. But in this country, appeals are reserved to the applicants who had their application refused. So you can see that there are 3 areas where town and parish councils should be involved. I think hearing more from you in relation to the formulation of national policy is very important, and particularly now, because sadly, I said we had some bad news from the House of Commons last night. This government has a bill in the Houses of Parliament called the Levelling Up Bill. And one of the perhaps lesser known parts of this bill is to take away from local planning authorities their supremacy in the writing of planning policy. So for the first time in 70 years, local democracy will not be determining planning policy. Ministers will be determining planning policy. We and quite a lot of people in local government think this is an appalling move. It is just about acceptable if national policy is more carefully scrutinized than it is at the moment. For example, perhaps national policy should be sent to both houses of Parliament for sign-off, because these are very important debates around things like Greenbelt. But the House of Commons defeated the House of Lords, who supported us last night, and as you know, the House of Commons has overall sovereignty over the House of Lords, so our amendment was crushed after months of trying to push it forward. So from tonight, basically, it's really, really important that you get involved in national policy, because it will trump local policy legally. But local plans will remain very important, particularly in relation to their site allocations, the actual areas of land with red lines drawn around them. So that's an important opportunity for you to make the views of your areas known to the local planning authority. And I think actually it's particularly important where councils are getting bigger. So it might be interesting to hear a little bit in response from the room on this, but North Yorkshire is a very big area. It used to have 5 or 6 districts in it. Now it has 1 council. I'm hopeful that North Yorkshire County Council will operate in as decentralised way as it can, but still, in a sense, that does very much elevate the role of town and parish councils, because there's nothing below the whole county that is a democratic body. So your role in influencing the local plan content is kind of growing by the year. But if you have views on the local plan and the allocations of land in it, it's really important that you put yourselves in the shoes of the local planning authority. So it's not particularly helpful for someone to say, we object to the allocation of this land outside our village for housing, because the local planning authority will have spent quite a lot of time working out which areas to allocate for housing. And they have overall objectives of the total number of new houses to permit to meet, which is what government says they have to do. So unless you can come up with an alternative proposal, just simply objecting to something is probably not going to get anywhere, because the local planning authority will have to then move that allocation to outside someone else's village, or find a site within an urban area maybe to allocate. And believe you me, they probably tried very hard to do that. So you have to indicate what is the planning reason why you might think that a site allocation is not acceptable. And actually, it'd be very interesting to see more local councils working with each other on that. So if it's a whole cooperative of you that agree, then that might make your views carry greater weight with the local planning authority, because you can say, well, we all agree that this should happen. Planning applications, you will normally be consulted by the local planning authority as a town or parish council as of right. You will also be consulted by the neighbouring council if you have if your area is near the boundary of the local planning authority that you're actually lodged in. I would say it's important that if you want to make comments on a planning application, that you use the policies in national policy and the local plan as the basis for your views, because it's only using those policies that the local planning authority will be able to make its decision. So you can't just say we don't like it. And another thing that quite often happens, I'm sure not with any of you, is that we get objections to planning applications that say things like the view would be changed. Well, nobody has a right to a view, so that isn't a legitimate reason for objecting to something. You can say that everybody's view might be changed, particularly if you're in an area of high landscape value, but to say the view from my bedroom, just me as a person, will change, that's not enough. It has to be the collective overall landscape feel. You may have been invited to, or your members may have been invited to speak at the planning committee in relation to a planning application. That quite often is time limited. Some councils talk about, you can speak for 3 minutes. It's very important, I have to put in a plea for the well-being of my members, that planning officers working for the council are treated with respect, because something that we have been hearing from our members is an increasing level of disrespect from certain members of the public, either people whose planning applications are recommended for refusal, or situations where members of the public are not happy because a planning application is recommended for approval. Just as you wouldn't insult someone working in the NHS, it's very important that you don't insult people who work in public sector planning, or else they will leave, as a third of them already have. And finally, a word on neighbourhood plans. Since 2012, it's been possible for town and parish councils to write their own plan. And this is legally added on to the local plan of the local planning authority to form a kind of extra bit. The neighbourhood plan, you may have done one. We've got around 1,000 that have now been brought into force. They go through a shorter procedure than the main local plan, but they do have a kind of light touch examination from an appointed inspector. And also they must be subject to a local referendum. But they have a very useful role to play, for example, in maybe allocating additional land for housing that goes above the decisions of the local planning authority, but may well contribute to meeting local housing need. Or it might be to allocate land for a community centre or other purpose. And another exciting thing that's been pioneered in some parts of the country is community infrastructure funding. So I know, for example, it's not a local council area, but the City of Plymouth has a crowdfunding system whereby the money that is gathered in a pot from developers who get granted planning permission is put into this pot. And within the different neighbourhoods in Plymouth, proposals come forward by crowdfunding, like, I don't know, a new playground or a seat or tree planting or something for the local area. And if it reaches a certain threshold, the city council will match fund the local crowdfunder amount of funding, so that doubles it. And that can mean that you, from the planning system, get this local infrastructure, which might be very helpful and might actually implement some of the neighbourhood planning purposes. So that's a ultra whistle-stop tour of an entire planning system. I see questions are bubbling in, so do look out for Politicians in Planning Network, which I will just spend some time looking up the reference to and post in the chat.